Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is Saturday, April 27th, and this is the 204th day since the attacks by Hamas on the south of Israel. One of the major things that's happening here in the United States right now are these student protests happening at major universities across the United States. According to CNN, these protests are predominantly pro-Palestinian. There are often counter-protests. Several schools have called police to remove demonstrators. And these are some of the videos that I was talking about yesterday. Some of these protesters are being very violently removed. About 100 people were detained today, Saturday, as officials cleared an encampment at Northeastern University in Boston, according to school officials, adding that those with student IDs would be released. At Cal Poly Humboldt in Northern California, it will close for the rest of the semester to go to remote instruction as protesters remain inside at least 2 campus buildings, according to officials. At New York's Columbia University, the epicenter of the demonstrations, the school's banned a student leader who said in January that Zionists don't deserve to live. He subsequently apologized. School policymakers voted on Friday to investigate the university's leadership's handling of the protests. Protesters at Columbia have been demanding that the school cut ties with Israeli academic institutions and disinvest from Israel-linked entities as the death toll climbs from Israel's bombardment of Gaza. Protesters at other campuses have similar demands. I was speaking to a reporter today, and he mentioned that some of the things that are being communicated in these protests aren't helpful. I mean, certainly any type of threat to someone's life is just unacceptable. And at Churches for Middle East Peace, we've been talking about how do we affirm people using their voices? How do we encourage people to be engaged in the most constructive of ways? How do we protect the right of free speech and also call for an end to all violence? We specifically call for the end to violence by police and law enforcement officers, against those who are protesting nonviolently. We want all students and all people to be safe and protected. We speak out against hate speech, any form of hate speech, and specifically language against Jews, anti-Semitic language, or language against Muslims or Palestinians. And we also think it's absolutely critical to differentiate between anti-Semitism and criticism of the state of Israel. And where to go to in terms of resources for that, there's some great resources online. I would point you to organizations like Trua, Jewish organizations that do a great job of differentiating. The Israeli newspaper Haaretz talked about the campus wars and reported that Kamani James, who's one of the leaders of the protest groups at Columbia, that he was actually banned from campus because of that video where he said that Zionists don't deserve to live. And Jewish organizational leaders yesterday accused Columbia University and other schools of cowardice for not disciplining anti-Israel protesters who have been flouting their rules of conduct on campus, accusing them of jeopardizing the safety of Jewish students. I wanted to share with you weekly, the Foundation for Middle East Peace does a roundup of bills and resolutions and things happening in Washington, D.C. Laura Friedman sent out the one this week, and she highlighted H.R. 6090. It's legislation that is talking about the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. So the H.R. 6090 was introduced in October 26th of last year, 2023, by Lawler, a Republican from New York. It has 42 bipartisan co-sponsors, and it's to provide the consideration of a definition of anti-Semitism set forth by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA, for the enforcement of federal anti-discrimination laws concerning education programs for activities and for other purposes. And they call it the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, referred to by the House Committee on the Judiciary. For background on the legislation, which has actually been introduced numerous times, it has, in Laura's opinion, and I follow her lead on this, and I think she's absolutely right. She said it has nothing to do with fighting anti-Semitism and everything to do with delegitimizing and suppressing campus free speech and activism that's critical of Israel. And she gives a link to a number of resources. I'd encourage you to go to the Foundation for Middle East Peace to find out more information. She says she invites people to take a deep dive into the history and objectives of the legislation. Again, HR 6090 IHRA. I can never remember acronyms. It stands for International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And here's the problem. The IHRA definition of anti-Semitism says any like, this is my summary of it, any criticism of the state of Israel is anti-Semitic. Like, essentially, that's a short summary. On April 29th, 2024, the House Rules Committee will take up HR 6090, meaning that they intend to bring the bill to the House floor to vote immediately. And on Capitol Hill, there's also a conversation about a federal anti-Semitism monitoring resolution, specifically related to U.S. colleges. So this is April 26th. On April 26th, the Jewish Insider reported that Torres and Lawler were pushing for a federal anti-Semitism monitoring on college campuses. Per that report, as encampments of anti-Israel protesters spring up on a growing number of campuses across the country, bringing with them instances of anti-Semitism, Representatives Richie Torres, a Democrat from New York, and Mike Lawler, a Republican from New York, are threatening to condition federal funding for universities as a part of a push for more stringent federal oversight and monitoring of anti-Semitism on campuses. This is according to the Jewish Insider. The lawmakers plan to introduce the College Oversight and Legal Updates Mandating Bias Investigations and Accountability, Columbia. So when you take the first letter of each of those words, the College Oversight and Legal Updates Mandating Bias Investigations and Accountability, it's kind of creative. It's the Columbia Act, which would allow the Department of Education to impose a third-party monitor for anti-Semitic activity on any campus receiving federal funding. Schools that do not adequately cooperate with monitoring could lose federal funding. Compliance with such monitoring would, under the proposed legislation, be a condition of receiving continued federal funds. The monitor would release quarterly public reports on progress. The proposed monitors would be appointed by the Secretary of Education, while expenses for the monitors would be paid for by the schools. I think what's disconcerting about that is not that we don't want to monitor hate speech and all of that. It's that why would we not equally monitor hate speech against Jews and Muslims and Palestinians and people of color? And I think that is what is concerning about that. And the fact that federal funding, could be cut. We want everyone to be safe on all campuses. In terms of the hostage and ceasefire negotiations, Hamas's deputy chief in Gaza, Khalil Ahaya, said that Hamas has received Israel's official response to its position over ceasefire talks. They're going to study the proposal before submitting their response. So it sounds like it's just going back and forth. Hamas did reveal a video of two Israeli hostages, 64-year-old Israeli-American Keith Siegel, who was taken captive from the kibbutz Kfar Aza on October 7th, and 47-year-old Amri Miran, who was kidnapped from his home at kibbutz Na'al Az on that day as well. In Gaza, the Israeli army has said that it has destroyed a site in which rockets were launched from towards Ashdod. They said that the Air Force also struck a vehicle that was carrying 8 members of Hamas in central Gaza. Aid shipments from Cyprus will resume after a pause. That's been paused since the killing of the World Century Central Kitchen aid workers. So a vessel left Larnaca on Friday night with aid donated from the UAE. BBC reported that British troops may be engaged moving forward in delivering aid to Gaza from an offshore pier that is now being constructed by the US military. The death toll, according to numbers from the health ministry, is now at 34,388 Palestinians, with 77,437 people being wounded. That's a minimum number. In terms of US and Israel relationships, the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, their Staff General Brown, said that the Israelis are creating, quote, a buffer zone or a bubble around the temporary pier in order to facilitate aid distribution, to keep the threat away from our forces so that aid could be distributed. The New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman wrote on Friday that according to US officials, President Joe Biden would consider restricting certain arms sales to Israel if it invades Rafah. These officials added that the Biden administration believes a Rafah operation would jeopardize a new hostage deal with Hamas, an Arab post-war peacekeeping force, and an Israeli-Saudi normalization. According to Israel, the army said that 30 rockets were fired at Mount Hermon area of northern Israel and that some were intercepted. There has been escalations between in other parts of the Middle East. An Israeli airstrike was reported in a southwestern Syrian city, according to media from Syria. They're saying that that attack was in response to rocket fire from Syria into the Golan Heights. And in Lebanon, an Israeli Army report indicated that a senior member of a terrorist group was killed in an airstrike in Lebanon. Israeli forces killed someone in Lebanon. In the West Bank, an additional 2 Palestinians were shot and killed, according to the Israeli army, after they had opened fire on an outpost in the West Bank near Jenin. And according to US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, he said that the Iran attack on Israel earlier this month, in which Israel and its allies intercepted the bulk of projectiles, should give Iran pause, and they should be questioning the effectiveness of their weapons systems and their planning. you may also remember that ship. There was that ship that was connected to Israel that was taken and seized earlier by Iran. It's believed that that has been granted consular access and it is expected to be freed. And then the Houthis have fired ballistic missiles from Yemen yet again towards 2 ships in the Red Sea. China has announced that they will host Palestinian unity talks between Hamas and Fatah, and the two groups and a Beijing-based diplomat communicated that yesterday. You'll recall that there were unity talks in Russia also. So that's the news for the day. Continue in your efforts. I've been seeing lots of op-eds, and so thank you for writing. Thank you for your efforts. Please, please, please continue. These moments are so incredibly critical. So lean into your relationships. Do so out of love. Continue to call for a comprehensive ceasefire, release of all hostages. I am not putting a downward thumb, but continue to work towards comprehensive efforts towards peace.